All right, thank you and hello. Thank you for having me. I thought I would talk a little bit about my new book, The Other Side of Nothing, and my name is Brad Warner, which is on the front of the book, just in case you didn't know what my name was. And this is my eighth or ninth book about Zen Buddhism. It's kind of difficult to calculate. They've come from different publishers and stuff. But suffice to say, I've been doing this for a while. I've been writing books about Zen Buddhism since, the first one came out in 2003, and that was Hardcore Zen. And I've done a bunch of others since then, as I said. And this book is about ethics, and it's also about non-duality. And to kind of get into what I want to talk about, I chose a chapter which is not from the beginning of the book, but it's actually from, I guess, almost exactly the middle of the book. If I put my hand here, you can see what I'm doing. And it's chapter 31, and it's called Don't Be a Jerk. And the title, Don't Be a Jerk, if you're a fan of one of my earlier books, had the title Don't Be a Jerk. And I decided to revisit that in the context of this topic of Buddhist ethics. In the earlier book, I used that title. Well, the title of the earlier book was my chosen title for an essay by Dogen. And Dogen was the 13th century founder of the sect of Buddhism that I have studied and practiced in for nearly 40 years, but it's probably exactly 40 years as of 2022. I started in the early 1980s, probably 1982 or 83. I'm not exactly sure. As a student at Kent State University in Ohio, I was then and am still now the bass player for a punk rock band called Zero Defects. And at the time that I discovered Buddhism, I was also very, very deeply into the punk rock scene. And for people who aren't deeply steeped in the variations of punk rock, might not be aware of this, but there was a kind of stream of punk rock that was, I was going to say popular. It wasn't that popular. There weren't that many of us, but it was something that was happening in the early 80s, and it was mostly centered in Washington, D.C. And these were punk rockers who were very much into ethics. They had a system, I don't know if you call it a system. They had a thing, whatever you want to call it, that they called straight edge. And to be straight edge meant that you didn't drink, you didn't do drugs, you didn't have meaningless sex. Those were the three things I remember being talked about a lot. And it was just a basic way of treating people ethically. For example, the big thing was slam dancing then, which is dancing by just running into each other on the dance floor in front of the band. And one of the things that the straight edge people would do is they would be very careful not to actually hurt anybody when they were slam dancing, and to pick up anybody who fell, never step on anybody. We had rules. You couldn't wear everybody loved those spiked wristbands, and you weren't allowed to wear the spiked wristbands when you were slam dancing, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of ethics involved in it. So when I discovered Buddhism, I felt that I discovered something that was taking the same sort of ethical stance that I was interested in the punk rock scene, and taking it to its ultimate conclusion. And this chapter kind of is, I think, the best sort of reflection of that. And we'll see, I'm going to keep an eye on the time and read as much of it as I think is appropriate, because I'd like to also talk about it. So let's jump in. And as I said, it's chapter 31, so we're quite a ways into the book, but I'll try to catch you up if I run into anything that needs to be explained. So here we go. The Noble Eightfold Path and the precepts are the most obvious examples of ethical teachings in Zen Buddhism. So the Noble Eightfold Path is the subject of the Buddha's first sermon. The first sermon that he gave after his experience of awakening. So the Buddha was probably most of you know, who was a prince who rejected the life of royalty and riches and political power to try to find the truth about reality. And after 7 years of searching different paths, he finally came upon what he called the middle way, which was a way that was not too difficult and not too easy, kind of like a Goldilocks version of spirituality. And he gave a sermon about what he thought were the most important things and to follow this middle way. And it was this ethical system called the Noble Eightfold Path, which I won't try to go into here. And then later on, there developed a set of precepts which Buddhists follow. And these were basically derived from monastic rules. So when they decided to set up a monastic system, there were rules that were needed in order for people to live together and practice together. And the original Buddhist order had something like 450, or I can't remember. There are tallies. Actually, there are different tallies of rules depending on which sources you go for. But anyway, hundreds of these rules. And when the Buddha died, when he was on his deathbed dying, he told his attendant Ananda that the order, when the Buddha died, could discard the minor rules, but they should keep the major ones. And then this is after Buddha died, they said to Ananda, okay, what are the major and minor rules? And Ananda basically said, I forgot to ask. You know, it's expressed more eloquently in the ancient scriptures, but if you read into them, the feeling I get whenever I read that passage is that Ananda is sort of embarrassed that he forgot to ask. So it became the job of later Buddhists to try to figure out which were the major and minor rules. And what they came up with was 10 rules, which are the 10 precepts. And they are quite similar to the 10 commandments, but they are phrased in a kind of different way. So they're all the basic things: don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat, don't lie. Some that are kind of unique to Buddhism, like don't misuse sexuality, don't give way to anger. And anyway, those are the main sort of Buddhist ethical systems. So I'm going to keep reading. But there are other interesting examples, okay? Dogen, who is the 13th century founder of this sect of Buddhism, believed that the most important teaching of Buddhism was do not do wrong. He wrote about this in an essay called Shoakumakusa. I wrote a book a few years ago in which I paraphrased that title as Don't Be a Jerk. Others have translated it as refrain from all evil whatsoever, not doing wrongs, and refrain from unwholesome action. Those are different translations of the Japanese phrase showakumakusa. Dogen said that this idea of not enacting evil isn't something that some wise person came up with a long time ago. It existed before you and I, or even Dogen, got here. He says that not doing wrong predates the universe. People did not invent the idea of doing right and avoiding wrong, he says, but people can learn to align themselves with what is right, and in doing so, align themselves with the universe. One of the most vexing issues for Western philosophy has always been the problem of evil. If God created the world, and if God is all good and all loving, then why is there evil? There are all sorts of answers to this question. Some of these answers try to preserve the idea of an all-good God in a variety of clever ways. Some, for example, suggest that maybe God cannot prevent evil, but that would make him less than all-powerful. Others say that God allows evil to exist in order to test us, but this calls God's pure goodness into question. Some of the Christian Gnostics even suggested that our world is under the rule not of God, who is nice, but of a sort of sub-God who is not very nice. And that's a very short interpretation of Gnosticism. I'm sure people might argue with that, but I think that's basically what some of the sects of Gnosticism believed. But that begs the question of why the real God doesn't do something about the sub-God. And of course, some people think that the existence of evil is proof positive that God simply does not exist. Buddhism doesn't have an all-powerful, all-good creator God in the sense that Christianity does. So a Buddhist doesn't need to explain the existence of evil in a way that preserves the existence of God or of his goodness. Dogen didn't look on evil as a thing that exists and sits around waiting for someone to do it. Rather, he believed that only action in the present moment is real. Sometimes the action we take is right, and sometimes it isn't. Evil only comes into being when people do the wrong thing. It's the same with good. There are three broad categories of action, he says. Actions can be right, wrong, or neutral. It's tricky to try to define right and wrong, and yet, like US Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said about obscenity in 1964, even though it's hard to define, we know it when we see it. Dogen recognized that there are similarities between right actions, no matter where or when they occur, and there are differences too, as there are with wrong actions. 800 years later, Sam Harris coined the term moral landscape to describe a similar idea. Harris says that we can think of morality as a kind of landscape. Every landscape looks different from every other. And yet, in each one, there are high points and low points. Even when the shape of the terrain varies considerably, we can still recognize which points are high and which are low. Even when cultures and customs are different from each other, we can still recognize right and wrong. Telling the difference between right and wrong requires balance, though. An unbalanced person can get very confused. And when you do the wrong thing, you become that much more unbalanced. Learning to tell when you're becoming unbalanced is one of the benefits of Zazen practice. You know the difference between right actions and wrong actions by how they make you feel. And I should stop here and maybe explain a little bit about Zazen, because Zazen is the type of meditation that I learned when I was young and that I still teach and practice today. And a lot of people who are Zazen practitioners reject the word meditation because the word meditation tends to imply that there's a goal to it, that you're trying to make something happen with your meditation, that you're trying to find balance that I've talked about in my chapter that I'm just reading to you, that you're trying to find enlightenment, that you're trying to become a better person, etc., etc. One of the most famous Zen teachers is a guy named Kodo Sawaki Roshi. And Kodo Sawaki was one of my teachers. So I had two main Zen teachers. One was an American guy named Tim McCarthy, who I studied with when I first started doing Zazen in Kent State University in Ohio. Then I moved to Japan when I was about 29 years old, I think. And while in Japan, I met a guy named Budo Wafu Nishijima Roshi, so Nishijima Roshi, we'll call him for short, was a student at one time of Kodo Sawaki. And Kodo Sawaki, I'm not sure when he was born, but he passed away in 1965. So he's, roughly contemporary. He's not in the distant past. And one of the things that Kodo Sawaki Roshi said was, Zazen is good for nothing, when he was asked what Zazen was good for. Because people always want you to sell them your meditation practice. And that's the common way it's done these days, especially these days, because in America and Europe and Australia and a lot of places around the world, South America, pretty much everywhere in the world these days, meditation is being sold as kind of a commodity. And when you're selling meditation as a commodity, what is normal to do is to advertise it. And what you do when you advertise a commodity is you tell people what it's going to do for them. You buy this gasoline and it's going to make your car run better. You buy this cereal and it's going to make you more regular. You buy this vitamin and it's going to give you energy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what people kind of expect. So they expect to be told that when you do this kind of meditation, you're going to get this, that, and the other thing. Usually it's mindfulness, equanimity, which is one of those college words I never quite understood. There are other things that you're supposed to get. You're supposed to become See, I just got advertised on what you call it, Instagram, an app that's supposed to give you the benefits of a 4-hour deep meditation in just 15 minutes. And I haven't tried it out yet. I just downloaded it yesterday or the day before, and I want to try it out because I've been meditating for 40 years, and I want to see if see what they think gives you a 4-hour deep meditation in 15 minutes. I'd like to find out what that's supposed to be, because I don't really believe it. There are lots of things that meditation is sold as a panacea for all ills. But Kodo Sawaki was different, and he's kind of not that much out of line with the entire Zen tradition in saying that Zazen is good for nothing. Zazen is a practice you do for itself. So the style of Zazen that we do in the version that I practice is called Shikhandhasa. And Shikhandhasa is just a kind of fancy Japanese way of saying just sitting. But the character used to express just in just sitting is not just as in just sitting around. It's more like just, doing nothing but. And the character, this is something, I lived in Japan for 11 years, so I have Japanese habits that people who are not Japanese don't understand. But one of the things Japanese people will do is they'll write the Chinese characters in the air when they want to explain themselves. So the character for just, which looks like a sort of a weird J, if you want to, and that's kind of funny that it spells just. Anyway, it's pronounced ta, and it represents a hammer hitting a nail, but it's extremely simplified. Kanji is, sorry to get on a tangent here, but Chinese characters are really funny because they started out almost like hieroglyphics, and then they were whittled down to simplified forms. So it's often very difficult to figure out the picture that is supposed to be being drawn. But in this case, the picture that is supposed to be being drawn with this character is a hammer hitting a nail. And it represents doing something for just exactly that thing. So what we do in the meditation practice that I have been practicing for nearly 40 years is we try to get into the total experience of doing nothing but sitting, just sitting still and not doing anything else. So it's good for nothing. It's not something we do to produce an effect in the future. It's just something we do for this moment. So let me get back into the book after that long explanation. A lot of people these days are looking for meaning and ethics, but instead they're finding big causes filled with moral posturing and slogans. When ethics are not balanced, things get weird. All sorts of unethical behavior can be made to seem justifiable when it's presented as a way to eradicate evil. And I think really the most evil things that humanity has ever done, Nazism, for example, everybody's go-to example of evil things, whatever it is, the worst of it is almost in every case being done as a way to eradicate evil. This is the best excuse to do terrible things. We humans are clever creatures. We can use our big, overdeveloped brains to justify absolutely any action. We can use crafty words to explain our wrongdoings both to others and to ourselves in ways that make them seem reasonable and right. But we always know when we're wrong, even if we cannot consciously acknowledge it. I know it sounds like a bold claim to say that we always know when we're doing wrong, so maybe I should modify it a bit. I always know when I am doing wrong. I assume I am not different from others in this, although I cannot offer you conclusive proof. So let's talk about me. The fact that I always know when I am wrong was the source of a few days of pure horror for me when I was sitting at a Zen retreat in a temple called Tokein, nestled among the peaceful tea fields of rural Shizuoka Prefecture in Japan, one very hot and humid summer. As I sat there in the stillness with nothing to distract me, I watched as my own mind justified wrongs I had committed in the past. The reasons I came up with were clever enough to convince any jury of my peers if I were ever taken to trial for the things I'd done. And yet I knew for a fact that I was lying to myself. Up until that moment, I thought that the only people who justified what they knew to be wrong were monsters, like members of the Nazi Party or the Ku Klux Klan. Not that I'd done anything to match the atrocities committed by some of those people, but I saw my own mind making the same sorts of excuses I'd heard from people like that. The moment I realized I was doing this, I was genuinely terrified of myself. It was as if every evil ever committed by humankind might as well have been committed by me. I was honestly unsure if I even deserved to live. My stomach did flip-flops for hours. But I'd done enough Zazen by then that I knew the drill. When stuff like that comes up, the best thing to do is to continue sitting still. So I sat still. Outside the temple, a chorus of cicadas buzzed away. Crows cawed, someone coughed, someone else adjusted his position and made the platform we sat on creak. My head slowly filled with abject horror, and then it overflowed. I sat. It's funny the kind of things that happen in a zendo. That's a place where you practice Zazen. If a stranger were to walk into a room full of people doing Zazen, she'd likely think that everyone is just blissing out in meditation. Maybe she'd imagine they're having beatific visions and probing into the true nature of reality. In fact, a lot of us in there are just trying to hold ourselves together and stay still while we freak out, which is what I was doing. I had to make a lot of changes after that. It was probably 20 years ago, and I am still far from finished making those changes. But to the extent that I have stopped justifying what I know to be wrong, my life has been happier. It's not always easy because excuses are endless. The trick in knowing when I'm making excuses is that excuses always take work. I can feel the wheels turning up there in my head while I make up justifications. When I notice that is happening, I withdraw energy from the process. It then becomes impossible to believe my own lies. I won't say I always do this with 100% efficiency, but when I do, it works extremely well. I'm left with only the bare recognition of my own action and no explanations or excuses. The process for doing this is watching my own mind play its tricks without interfering, without helping it play those tricks or even trying to stop it from doing so. I just let it happen and watch. It's actually quite fascinating. That's Shikhandhasa practice that I just explained to you a minute ago. Buddhist ethics do not allow for excuses. There is no external God we can appeal to who might accept our excuses. We cannot plead our case to anyone but ourselves. I have to be unflinchingly honest with myself if I want to follow the Buddhist way of ethical action. Wrong action that results in personal gain can make me feel good in the short term. And when I say personal gain, I'm not just talking about money. If I get some kind of pleasant sensory experience of so-called satisfaction from doing something wrong, that is also personal gain. That righteous feeling I get when I think I'm a hero who has vanquished an evil villain is one of the most devious of these pleasant sensory experiences. Even when that happens, there will always be some part of me that knows better. I can try to ignore that part. I can shove it way, way back to the darkest corners of my mind, but it will never go away. I'll always know I did wrong, no matter how skillfully I'm able to deny it to myself. Dogen says that the essence of rightness, wrongness, or neutrality is non-appearance. Now, right here, I am explaining a kind of a weird, tricky phrase that comes up in in most of the translations of this essay by Dogen called Shoaku Makusa. So that's what I'm doing here. He says, this is Dogen, he says that they are the state without excess and are real form. This is rightness, wrongness, and neutrality. At the same time, he says, at each concrete place, these three properties include innumerable dharmas. So that's some weird talk, and I'm going to see in my book if I can unpack it, and I'm going to read my own book and see how well I did, and maybe tell you how well I think I did. That's Dogen's way of putting it, but as we know, it's not easy to follow Dogen sometimes. When Dogen says things like non-appearance or the state without excess or innumerable dharmas, it gets confusing. So let me see if I can put it differently. Nishijima Roshi always explained the meaning of non-appearance as instantaneousness. Here's how he put it in a blog he wrote. Rightness, wrongness, neutrality, and so on do not have any relation with appearance or disappearance because they are all real situations at the present moment. Instantaneousness means something that occurs spontaneously in this real moment. The state without excess, that's one of Dogen's phrases, is a little easier. It means things just as they are, without anything extra added. Of course, it's always possible to add something extra, like an excuse or a justification, which is precisely the problem. Most of us habitually add excess to whatever we do by adding in the idea that our actions are the activities of a personal self. And this gets into the other aspect of this book that I talk about probably more in other chapters than this, which is the idea of non-self. And the idea of non-self is probably one of the most confusing ideas in all of Buddhism. And it comes out of the fact that Buddhism derives from the earlier Indian religious tradition, which is often called Hinduism, although there are people who will argue that the word Hinduism is probably a misnomer. But that's a whole other subject I don't want to quite go into, but let's just go in, let's just say it like that. And in that system, there was an idea that's enshrined in the Bhagavad Gita and other texts of Hinduism, that what we really are is a kind of immaterial soul that is immortal and unchanging, that exists somehow within this impure material body. So the impure material body is a covering of the pure material soul. Now, I should be fair to say that later derivations of Hinduism have kind of done away with that idea. But in Buddha's time, it was usually presented that way as this kind of hard dichotomy of the pure spirit and impure matter. And one of Buddha's great innovations, or the way that he broke from the tradition that existed at his time, was to say there is no division. There is nothing but one thing that is not self as a pure thing that exists in the body, or other or matter that exists as an impure thing outside of the body. In later versions of Buddhism, this became identified as self. So this is where it gets real confusing, and I'm not going to even try to dig into all the permutations of this and all the other stuff that goes into it. But in the Zen tradition, we talk about self, but the self that we're talking about is not individual self. It is the self of the universe. Dogen uses the word jiko, which is just a very common Japanese word that means self, and people still use it to these days to mean, myself. But when Dogen used the word jiko, he was talking about a kind of a universal self that doesn't end with me, that includes everything. So let's continue with the chapter. Finally, Dogen says that rightness, wrongness, and neutrality include innumerable dharmas. Dharma is a very funny word. This just means that every activity of an individual is also the activity of the entire universe. Dharma, in this case, is a kind of catch-all term that means pretty much anything and everything. You can't even scratch your butt without the entire universe contributing to that action. I mean it. Think about it. The very fact that there is a butt for you to scratch involved the entire evolution of the human species, and the evolution of the human species involved the entire evolution of life on Earth, and the evolution of life on Earth involved the entire evolution of the solar system, and the evolution of the solar system involved the entire evolution of the Milky Way galaxy. I could go on, but I hope you get the picture. Your ability to make the movements involved in scratching your butt derives from energy patterns that extend far beyond anything you can possibly conceive. Your ability to move at all comes from the energy stored in the food you've ingested, which comes from the sun, because plant energy derives from the sun, and even if you eat meat, the animals you ate got their energy from plants. Even the sun's energy doesn't come from nowhere. It's the result of nuclear fission, which has to do with the force of gravity mashing the particles that make up the sun together. I'm no scientist, but I know it's an insanely complicated process. The fact that the sun has energy to contribute to you scratching your butt is attributable to processes that go back to the Big Bang and probably far beyond. That itch you feel has its own infinite history too, as does your desire to scratch it, as does everything about you and your butt. The point is that no matter what you do, literally innumerable dharmas are involved. I should go and explain a little bit about the word dharma because it's kind of interesting. The word dharma initially meant the Buddha's teaching. In fact, it predates even Buddha. It just meant sort of spiritual teaching in general. It's called dharma. And I think most of the time when people use the word dharma in English these days, that's generally what they're pointing to. But in later versions of Buddhism, as Buddhism progressed, the word dharma's got to mean, as I say in the book, basically everything. Everything is a dharma. So that's the word dharma. The good news, getting back to the book, the good news is that there is a way to end all evil, and that is to simply refrain from doing what is wrong. Obviously, this will not rid the world entirely of all evil action in one fell swoop. Good luck finding a way to do that. But the more people who commit to refraining from doing what they know to be wrong, even when they've got a damned good excuse to do it, the less evil will be present in the world. It's like when Nishijima Roshi told me, you can't fix your company, but you can make things a little better. This is a reference to a story I told earlier in the book where I was working for a company in Japan that made giant monster movies and TV shows. And I was feeling like everything was going wonky in the company. And it turned out I was right, because the company basically, well, they're still in business, but they sold all the original Tsuburaya family who owned the company and started the company are no longer involved in it. So it really kind of crashed. But at that time, I was really worried about what I could do to fix this company. And I went to my Zen teacher of all people to talk about this problem. And he told me that you can't fix your company, but you can make things a little better. And I found that was great advice, because I just tried to make what I did a little better. So let's continue with the book. He said that although I couldn't fix everything that was wrong where I worked, I could at least make a little difference. That was some of the best advice I have ever received. It has so many applications. You can't fix global climate change, but you can make a little difference. You can't fix race relations, but you can make a little difference. You can't fix the economy, heal the natural environment, undo centuries of human abuse and neglect. You can't be Superman and make the world spin backwards so that time goes in reverse so you can prevent some disaster before it happened like he did in that one movie. You can't do any of that, but you can make a little difference. So make a little difference. Watch carefully for your opportunity, and when it arrives, do that one positive, helpful thing that is available to you at that moment, which is the only real moment that has ever existed. Maybe no one will notice. Maybe even you yourself won't be able to see the difference you've made, but that's no reason not to make the effort. Forget about being rewarded or even patted on the back for the good things you do. Just do what's right without any thought of compensation. Or if you do think of compensation, just put that thought aside. It doesn't mean anything. It arises out of habit. It doesn't make you a bad person or anything like that. It simply means you're normal. Forget about it if you can. And if you can't forget about it, don't worry. Just keep on working for good in your own small way. Another odd thing that Dogen says is that right and wrong are time, and yet time is not right or wrong. Each action we take creates time. Time is not something apart from ourselves. Time is being. Dogen coined a phrase, uji, which is actually his own weird pronunciation, of a word that means sometimes in Japanese. But it combines the Chinese character for time with the Chinese character for being. And he started talking about being time. And what I'm going to go into right now is basically that in my own kind of version. Each action we take creates time. Time is not something apart from ourselves. Time is being. You and I are time. Every action we take affects the whole of the universe and the whole of time. We have a very limited view of ourselves. We imagine that we can do things in secret or on a small scale. This is an illusion. Every action we take is extraordinarily important. We have a tremendous responsibility. Everything we do affects everyone and everything else there is. I might imagine I can do a small bad thing and that as long as nobody notices it, I can get away with it. But the very fact of me noticing is the universe noticing it. I am the eyes and ears of the universe. So are we all. I never get away with anything. When I think I do, I'm just fooling myself. That can be really hard to believe sometimes. I'm always seeing people who do what I know to be very bad things, who nevertheless end up rich or famous or powerful. Meanwhile, people who are perfectly nice end up getting cancer and dying young. But Buddhists are kind of funny when it comes to this stuff. For one thing, what constitutes good fortune and bad fortune for regular people often doesn't work for Buddhists. Becoming rich, famous, and powerful is not always the best thing that can happen to a person. In fact, according to Buddhists, it's usually the worst. The richer, more famous, and more powerful you are, the less opportunity you're likely to have to encounter the truth. When Buddhists say this, they mean truth with a capital T, but it also works for truth with a lowercase t. How do rich, famous, powerful people ever know who their friends really are or what people actually think of them? They've always got to wonder if people are just pretending to like them in order to get something from them. It's got to be a hellish experience, no matter how many Lamborghinis and vacation homes in the south of France it allows you to afford. As for truth with a capital T, what incentive does a rich, famous, powerful person have to do the hard work required to connect with their true self? They usually end up just indulging in the so-called finer things until their bodies finally collapse from their own vices. Maybe there are exceptions. I mean, Sting seems like a pretty spiritual guy, and he's rich as hell. He also seems like a decent fellow. The problem is, for a guy like Sting, even if he encounters a genuine spiritual teacher, how can he be sure that the spiritual teacher isn't just interested in his money and fame? It's very tricky. I feel my relationships with my own teachers were much better than the kinds of relationships with teachers that are possible for rich and powerful people. My teachers always knew they weren't ever going to get anything of value from me, and I knew it too. That sort of thing was never even an issue. The bottom line is, being rich and famous isn't the best thing that can happen to you, nor is being dirt poor necessarily always the worst. Don't get me wrong. Poverty can really suck. There have been times in my life when I was so poor that even scraping together $60 to rent a room in a dilapidated punk rock house was damned hard. I did not like it. When I lived in Kenya, I lived in Kenya in Africa when I was a child for about 4 years of my childhood. I saw poverty so crushing, it was hard to imagine how people managed to live at all. Still, the early Buddhists took a vow of poverty. They deliberately relinquished everything they had and lived only on what they could beg for. They did this so they could be free from even the slightest bit of greed. A few Buddhists still do this, but it's not as common as it used to be, and it's very rare in the West. I've never taken the deliberate leap into total poverty that the early Buddhists did, but I know some people who have, and none of them have ever regretted it. They discovered that they actually owned the entire universe. But let's get back to what Dogen says about the matter of right and wrong. When wrong is not done by someone, he says, evil doesn't come into existence. That's the bottom line. But it's hard for people to come to terms with this, and it bears repeating again and again, so he repeats it a lot in this essay. According to Dogen, even if I lived in a place where I had all sorts of opportunities to do the wrong thing, and even if I lived at a time when everyone seemed to be hurting each other and taking unfair advantage of each other, even if all my friends were doing terrible things and I knew they'd never call me out for the bad things I did, and even if I ended up in circumstances where the easiest thing to do was also the wrong thing to do, I still have the power to overcome all of that stuff by simply refusing to do what I know to be wrong. That, I think, is one of the most powerful teachings in all of Dogen's writings. So I've repeated it in probably every book I've written in some form or another. Some people believe in Satan, who is an evil being who compels us to do bad things. But that always seemed to me like a lame excuse. Wrong has no fixed form. Wrong action is itself powerless. It has no voice of its own. It has no tools at its disposal. It doesn't even exist at all until one of us brings it into the world of our own volition, even when we always know, if often only in the most hidden regions of our subconscious, that we are doing the wrong thing. You can choose to do wrong, or you can choose not to do wrong. The moment you understand that wrong action doesn't exist outside of your own conduct at this very moment, you have realized a profound truth. It's not like you get this realization all at once and then it's yours to keep forever. It comes up dynamically moment after moment. And yet, doing the right thing at this moment is simultaneously doing the right thing at every moment in the past, present, and future. This is because this very moment is the whole of time and the entirety of the universe. Nishijima Roshi told Jürgen Segelke, a German student of his, that every action is carved into the universe. Whatever you do in this real moment right now, he said, can never be undone. So I'll stop my reading there because I've gone long enough. And there are different parts of this book. This book is kind of interesting even to me because I wrote it, and after writing it, I went through an editorial process, both on my own and with an editor at New World Library who published the book. And then I read the audiobook version of it and went over it again. So I've gone over this book a lot of times, and one of the processes I went through in writing this book was that I wrote chapter one like a dozen times. Is these chapter ones of various books that I tried to write that I finally just sort of ended up mashing together in one book. But I feel like this teaching that I paraphrase as "don't be a jerk" is really one of the most key teachings in all of Buddhism. And one of the problems with Buddhism as it's presented these days is that sort of commercial Buddhism as it exists nowadays is often very much focused on experiences, on having a cool experience. You know, this experience of enlightenment or awakening is kind of the thing that people are taught to go for. And even when they're not taught to go for, there's enough of it in the various literature about Buddhism that exists these days well, I'll tell you what I'm thinking of when I'm saying this, is that even when I started, my first teacher Tim and Nishijima Roshi, neither of them taught Buddhism as something like that. In fact, they were very much against that. But I got it into my head that what I was doing this practice for, what I was spending, an hour a day, usually, cut up into 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes at night of meditation. What I was spending that hour a day on was to have this great experience that the Buddha had, and that I assumed my teachers had, and that other teachers had, where they had this awakening experience, sometimes called Satori, sometimes called Kensho. It goes by a lot of names in the literature, and that this was the experience that would fix all my problems. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to do this meditation so that I'll have this experience that fixes all my problems. And I think this has been a kind of perennial problem for Buddhists, because you can even find Dogen writing about it 800 years ago, in which he says, no, that is not the point of Buddhism. The point of Buddhism is don't do wrong. And you go, well, don't do wrong. There's an old story that Dogen tells that predates even Dogen by a few hundred years, that a student goes up to a Buddhist teacher and says, what's the point of Buddhism? And the teacher says, just do what's right and don't do what's wrong. And the student says, geez, even a 5-year-old could say that. And the teacher says, well, yeah, even a 5-year-old child could say that, but even an 80-year-old man, which I assume is the age of the master himself who's saying this, has trouble doing it. And that's the point. The point is, it's difficult. And the way to find the proper balance for doing what's right and not doing what's not right is to do this practice. At least that's what my teachers have told me. At least that's what the tradition that I'm part of has told me, which is to do this non-directed practice of Zazen, which I spoke about earlier in this talk, in which you're doing the practice that is good for nothing. You're doing a practice that is only intended to be what it is. So just sitting. So you sit your Zazen, your meditation, in order to sit Zazen. And it might seem like, well, what's going to happen if we do that? Shouldn't we be trying to do something? But the problem with trying to do something is that what you end up setting up as a goal for yourself is a product of the same confused state of mind that you're trying to work on with the practice. So any vision you have of enlightenment or how great it's going to be, even if it's a very vague vision, is a vision conjured up by the same confused state of mind that you're trying to work on. So no matter how beautiful it and perfect it appears, it's the creation of your own mind. And one of the pitfalls of Zen practice is that sometimes the states we encounter in Zen, which can admittedly often be beautiful, tremendous, freeing, blissful, whatever you like, those states of bliss and tremendousness are often also the product of the confused state of mind going, here's bliss for you. And it's just the kind of invention of bliss, but since it's my own invention of bliss, since it's the invention of bliss that I came up with, I'm much more likely to get fooled by it. So that's why in our practice, we continuously try to set aside anything that happens, including positive things, including experiences of enlightenment. You try to set that aside as much as you can. And you try to do what is right and avoid doing what is wrong. So there you go. There's my talk. It's from my book, The Other Side of Nothing. If you want to pick it up, that's always nice. Or if you just enjoy the lecture, that's good too. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, and have a good time all the time.